to Jesus, "Even if everyone else falls away, I will not fall away." Peter, who fell away. What would these words have sounded like to Peter at this moment in his life? Would it have felt like an awful tease? Would it have felt like a cruel joke? Would it have felt like an audacious insult to hear the story that they told? You can feel the tension in the room, but they just keep saying it. The tomb was empty. The tomb was empty. We didn't believe it either, they said. I'm telling you, we were standing there with our spices in our hands and our mouths hanging open, perplexed by these things, when suddenly there was two men in dazzling white clothes who stood beside us. They looked at us and they said to us, "Why do you search for the living among the dead?" We were terrified. We fell to the ground. They said, "Why do you search for the living among the dead? He is not here, but he is risen." All of these things they told to the disciples, these three and the other women who were with them, not long after the sun had risen on the first day of the week. But to these disciples, the words that they spoke to them seemed to be an idle tale, and they did not believe them. And can you blame them? Can you blame this bewildered crowd grieving here together? Here they are trying to process the death of this one who should have been king. They're trying to process and understand the death of this one who should have been untouchable. Can you blame this band of hopefuls who had committed their life to follow this Jesus? Can you blame them for not believing the story? No, the words that these women spoke on this morning sounded to them like an idle tale, and they did not believe them, except for one of them. Only one of them, as Luke tells the story, believed enough, and that was Peter. Last week we began a discussion of Peter taking the next step in his faith. We've talked all along in this series about how in the beginning of Peter's story, when he comes onto the scene, Peter is invited to follow Jesus and to see what he would make of him. Peter's invited to come along and decide what he would believe about this Jesus. And over the course of something like 3 years following in the footsteps of Jesus, Peter comes to some pretty strong conclusions about who this Jesus is. He came to believe that he is the Son of God. He came to love him dearly, like a brother. He came even to the realization that he would give up his own life to see this Jesus take the throne that he deserved. And yet when Peter says these things to Jesus, when he says, "I will lay down my life for you, Lord," Jesus says to him, "Where I am going, you cannot follow me now. In fact, you may say that you would give your life for me, but Peter, before the rooster crows tomorrow morning, you will deny that you even know me 3 times. In essence, Jesus says to Peter, you may think that you are ready to take that next step in your faith, but you're just not as ready as you think that you are. And so today we ask the question, what will it take for Peter to take that next step in his faith in Jesus? What will it take for Peter to move forward, to commit his life to Jesus and not turn back? And in a way, we're asking the question not just about Peter, but about ourselves. What will it take for you and me to do the same? Well, at this point, one thing is clear. By the time that Peter hears this story that the women tell when they are returning from what they've called the empty tomb, Peter has reached his lowest low. As you remember the story in the Gospel of Luke, after Jesus is arrested, Peter follows the crowd. Peter follows in Jesus' footsteps to the courtyard. He slips in between the bodies in the crowd and he enters the courtyard and he's standing in the courtyard warming himself by the fire. When 3 times, you know the story, 3 times someone says to Peter, surely you knew this man, Jesus. And 3 times when people ask him, "Do you know Jesus?" Peter says, "I do not know the man," just as Jesus said that he would. At this point, Peter has reached his lowest low. And after that third denial, you remember, Luke tells us that the rooster crowed and that the Lord turned and looked at Peter. Can you imagine how low he must have felt in that moment? And Luke says that when the Lord turned and looked at Peter, Peter remembered what Jesus had said to him, and he went out and he wept bitterly. Peter has reached his lowest low. And not only that, but while this is happening, while Peter slips off of the stage in this gospel, a broken man, an ashamed man, Jesus returns to center stage carrying a cross. Peter's mentor, his Lord and teacher, his friend, the one that he had followed, the one that he had hoped would save Israel, carries a cross up a hill called Calvary, and between 2 criminals, dies a cruel and brutal and inexplicable death. And all of Peter's hopes, all of Peter's expectations die with him. All these years of following Jesus, well, are they worthless now? All of these things that I believed about this Jesus, what do they matter now if he's hanging on a cross? What do they matter now if he's buried in a tomb? Peter has reached his lowest low. Not only has Peter denied Jesus, but he's also lost the very reason to hope. And all that he has now is the memory of that look across the courtyard when the rooster crowed and Jesus gave his life. What could possibly rescue Peter from this dark place that he's in? Amazingly, it's this story, the one that the women tell, breathless as they return from the tomb of Jesus. The story that no one else could believe because it was so unbelievable, because it was so unfathomable. This story, this wild tale, can rescue Peter if the story is true. So the women who saw the tomb tell their story, but the words seemed to these apostles to be an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter, who is at his lowest low, got up and he ran to the tomb, his heart racing, his mind racing faster than his feet would take him. Peter ran to the place where they had laid him, and stooping and looking in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves, and he went home, amazed at what had happened. Peter saw the empty tomb. Maybe he heard the women's story echoing in his mind as he did. Why do you search for the living among the dead? He is not here. He is risen. Peter went home amazed at what had happened. Now we've been saying for many weeks now in this series that the story of Peter is a story about seeing clearly. That's what we said from the very first week that we started on this journey through the life of Peter. We started in Mark 8, and we heard the story of a blind man who was healed twice. The first time he could see, but not clearly, and then later he could see in full. And Peter is like that blind man all throughout this gospel, seeing Jesus, but not clearly so. Peter sees that Jesus is the Messiah. He sees that Jesus is the Son of God, but he doesn't know what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah. He doesn't know what it means for this king to be made king. And every gospel demonstrates this, that so long as Peter cannot fathom what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah, so long as Peter cannot comprehend that Jesus must go to the cross, So long as those things are true, Peter can never take that next step forward in his faith. Because when Jesus dies on the cross, Peter's hope dies with him. But if the story is true, and if the tomb was empty, then there's hope for Peter. And there's hope for you and me. And only in the light of that morning, only in the light of that empty tomb, can Peter truly see Jesus for who he really is. Only in the light of that empty tomb can Peter get it. Can he truly see clearly? Only in the light of the empty tomb can Peter take that next step. This morning, I would suggest that the same is true for you and me. If you're a Christian today, you know as well as I do that your faith and your hope and your future rest on this wild tale told breathlessly that we believe upon further examination proved true. If you're a Christian today, you know as well as I do that your faith and your hope and your future is bound up in the story of this empty tomb. And we believe that only when we see Jesus risen can we truly see him clearly. And if you're not a Christian today, but you're here today thinking about these things, that you may not know what to think of them. It's a bizarre story. You may be skeptical about this bold claim that Jesus rose from the dead, this wild tale that these people told so many years ago. I'll admit, it's hard for me to step into the shoes of someone who doesn't believe, because all my life I've believed this story. But if you're coming at this story and you're not a Christian, you have doubts about it, I don't think it's irrational to have doubts about this story, to have some questions at least that need answering. Remember, as Luke tells this story, there's only one amongst that group that was closest to Jesus, the ones that knew him best. There's only one of them who hears the initial story and runs to the tomb. The rest of them were skeptical in the beginning. The rest of them had doubts that they had to overcome. It took time for the full force of this story to awaken within them. It took time for the reality of the empty tomb to really set in. So if you hear the story this morning and you're a Christian and you think, or you're not a Christian and you think, wait a second, how could this be? Well, you're not alone. Many have asked that same question. But even if you think that, and it's okay if you do, but even if you think that, you and I can both surely agree that if the story is true, then that changes things. If this man Jesus, who claimed to be God's Son, really did die and really was raised from the dead, then that surely says something about these claims that he was making. In other words, you may decide what you will about this story, and it's your decision to make whether you accept it or you discard it, or right now you're somewhere in between. But if the story is true, that changes things. If the story is true, we can't very well just ignore it. If the story is true, then only in the light of the risen Jesus can we truly see the world clearly. It all hangs on this story, on this moment in history. Even in our Holy Scriptures, even in one of the Christian writings of Paul makes it clear that if Christ has not been raised from the dead, then our proclamation has been in vain and your faith has been in vain. He even says we're even found to be misrepresenting God if it's true that the dead are not raised. But Paul says, make no mistake, Christ has in fact been raised from the dead. And he appeared to Peter, which we see later on in Luke's gospel. And he appeared to the other apostles. And he appeared to more than 5,000 brothers and sisters at once. There are witnesses who testify not just to the empty tomb, but to the risen Jesus. Witnesses who believed that only in the light of the reality of this empty tomb could they see things clearly. My challenge for you this morning is simple enough. It's that we must at least consider the weight of this reality if this reality proves true. My challenge to you this morning is that even if you are at your lowest low, like Peter was, even if you are weighed down with doubts or skepticism or shame or guilt, all those things that Peter must have been feeling, even if you're weighed down with those things, my challenge for you today is to do as Peter did and go to the empty tomb. Listen to the story. Consider the weight that it bears and see whether you, like Peter, in the light of that Sunday morning sun, may leave that place amazed at what has happened and more ready than ever before to take that next step. I want to close this morning with a word from C.S. Lewis. Many of you are familiar with him. C.S. Lewis is a Christian writer at the early part of the 20th century who, for a good part of his young adult and adult life, did not believe in the wild tales, so to speak. He did not believe in the resurrection. He didn't believe Christianity had any place in someone's life. Lewis was a well-educated man, a well-read man. He studied and he taught at Oxford University in England. And through the course of his education and his study, he came across so many stories, different stories from different cultures about such and such God who became a man, or such and such great moral teacher or philosopher, or such and such miracle worker or healer. And he began to think, how could this story, the story that Christians hold, be any different than all of these other stories? But over the course of his life, as he began to wrestle with the empty tomb, as he began to dig into this story about the risen Jesus, he began to, with the help of several friends, he began to really feel the weight of this story. He began to wrestle with the testimony of those who saw him risen. Began to wrestle with the ripples of evidence that have pulsed throughout history. And he began to believe. And he gave his life to believing in this empty tomb. Years later, in a book that he wrote called The Weight of Glory, Lewis wrote these words: I believe in Christianity. I believe in the empty tomb, you might say. I believe in Christianity like I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. My hope and my prayer for all of us is that each of us may be able to make those words our own, because only in the light of the empty tomb can we truly see clearly. This morning, I want to offer an invitation. This invitation is bound up in the promise and the hope that comes from that empty tomb. Perhaps you, like Peter, have wrestled with doubts in your life, or skepticism in your life, or guilt and shame, the kind that Peter felt when he had denied Jesus. Well, as we see today, and as we'll continue to see next week as we continue this story, for those who live in the light of the empty tomb, the story doesn't have to be that way. We don't have to be wrapped up in our doubts and guilt and shame. We can be free from those because of what Jesus has done. Maybe today you're resolved to just give the story of the empty tomb a second chance, to give the story of the risen Jesus another look, knowing that if the story is true, as I believe that it is, if the story is true, it changes everything. Maybe today you're ready to proclaim, as Christians throughout history have proclaimed, that the story is true, that the grave was empty, and that you're ready to take the next step. We invite you this morning, if that's the case, to participate in a practice that Christians have practiced for years since the beginning, to be baptized, to be plunged into the water and raised up out, which proclaims to everyone that you believe it's true that Jesus died and rose again, and that you commit your life to Him. Whatever the case may be this morning, if you feel compelled by the message of the gospel this morning, would you come? While together we stand and while we sing.